Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Peter and to everybody who's coming out. This is a real treat, and I really appreciate being invited. I'm going to share my screen here with my PowerPoint. And what I'm going to be talking about is masculinity in crisis in the coalfields in the eastern part of the United States. And this is based on some ongoing research that I've been doing for my dissertation and roughly 80 some interviews with a diverse array of people living in the coalfields, in particular parts of the coalfields in Appalachia. So coal mines are shuttering and masculinity is in crisis in the Appalachian Mountains in the eastern United States. In this region in central Appalachia, which covers at least 4 states, the cultural politics of coal mining articulate coal extraction to gendered subjectivities. And many believe that coal mining, in that subjectivity, many believe that coal mining is real men's work. Those subjectivities are now in crisis. So in this paper, I ask how gender politics change in the contemporary economic transition. So Appalachia's economic transition, and here in this little box is the Appalachian region. Appalachia's economic transition is a bellwether for energy transition underway in numerous places across the world. This region is uniquely situated in the global decline of coal and among landscapes of decarbonization to speak to the experience of economic transition, effectively because marketable coal reserves are depleting here faster than in many coal fields worldwide. Well, there's also strong political support for coal mining, which has stymied efforts to plan for an economic transition. So there's been, in many ways, less foresight or planning. However, as a site of energy transition that's seemingly ahead of these inevitable transitions in the many fossil fuel dependent economies across the world, Appalachia holds important lessons about the politics of decarbonization and energy transformation. So Appalachian coal politics have much to say about shifting gender politics and energy transition and gendered subjectivities articulated to fossil fuel industries. In this talk, I bring feminist political economy literature into conversation with queer theories of time and temporality to consider the shifting gender frames in Appalachia's contemporary economic transition, how people's framings of gendered identities and subjectivities reorient and reframe in a shift from pro-coal political mobilization to post-coal nostalgia. Together, feminist political economy and queer theory offer insights into the shifting landscapes of gendered labor and long-term social implications for what feminist geographer Linda McDowell terms the feminization of labor. Queer theory provides an analytic approach to consider how nostalgia for the imagined prosperity of coal mining can be read as a fear of a future that is outside the heteropatriarchal labor regime of family wages. That is a fear of a queer future. So the region has seen 2 major shifts in political subjectivities and gendered politics in recent decades. First, the rise in pro-coal politics. For the most of the century and a half of coal mining in the Appalachian region, class conflict has defined the industrial labor community relations in the coal fields. Miners have gone through successive battles for union power. From the 1890s, the 1920s, the 1980s. However, in the 2000s, the Appalachian coal fields have been marked by pro-industry sentiment and even political mobilization for the industry, with pro-coal rallies and counter-protests at anti-strip mining protests. The second shift is currently underway, and that is the shift from pro-coal to post-coal subjectivities. So what caused these shifts? First, what's important to say is the coal industry has employed increasingly less people in recent decades, as this chart shows, a trend that surface mining and mountaintop removal have expedited in the past 2 decades. The second factor is that the coal industry finance groups have effectively manufactured what sociologist Shannon Bell calls a community economic identity in the moment when the coal industry is increasingly less relevant as an economic engine or employer. That is to say, people have come to identify and see themselves as represented by the coal industry. So why did this fabrication of community identity work? Surely people are not just duped, right? First, as I detail in this paper, the cultural politics of coal mining has articulated with a gendered labor identity and gendered politics of family wage jobs in such a way that people are interpolated by pro-coal rhetoric. They see themselves in the advertisements, the slogans, the gear. And second, many people in the coal fields also live in fear of a future without family wages, a gendered and sexual fear of what is understood as a queer future, again. So this shift from pro-coal politics to post-coal politics is emergent and unevenly formed. However, it's very clear to me, at least from my research, that there is a growing consensus around the region that coal is no longer the future. In the wake of a politics of coal futures, what has developed is a politics of nostalgia, grievance, and resentment. And this kind of resentment articulates with national trends and right-wing populism that draw on resentment against coastal elite wealth and urban growth. Drawing on the work of political theorist Wendy Brown, I'll argue that this resentment is a direct outgrowth of the neoliberalized policies that discourage planning for coal's demise and rely on the image of a white male head of household figure as a subject for their political rationality. And the contradiction between a regime that both fails to provide opportunities for white men to secure family jobs or jobs that support a family, but also exalts the family wage as essential to their political project, leaves many in the region angry, bitter, nostalgic, and has thrown the region into a political crisis of hegemony. So coal mining holds a particular place in the identity and politics of the Appalachian region, one where masculinity, femininity, and family are understood through the subject position of the coal miner. Geographers, sociologists, and political theorists have identified how coal miners and his family supporting wage are at the center of the cultural politics of coal in Appalachia. So cultural politics is an analytic that treats culture itself as a site of political struggle, paying particular attention to the relations of the material and the symbolic, people, things, and their representation. Cultural politics studies the, quote, way that culture, including people's attitudes, opinions, beliefs, and perspectives, as well as the media and the arts, shapes society and political opinion, and gives rise to social, economic, and legal realities. And scholars of Appalachian cultural politics detail how pro-coal politics were produced through the articulation of gender, race, and work. Rebecca Scott discusses how support for the industry has related to ideas about masculinity, the idea that coal mining jobs were the work of real men and real work, one of the few opportunities to support a family, and to the workings of race and class. In a region regularly represented as home to white trash, the middle class livelihood and position of sacrifice associated with coal mining has provided some people a position from which to evade the racially coded, degrading markings of poverty. Conversations about economic transition also operate through the articulation of race, class, and gender. That's to say, additionally, gender performances have always been framed through specific social, political, and geographic contexts. Karen Beckwith elaborated the concept of framing gender to show that in Appalachia, the gender frame of masculinity has shifted as coal mining contexts have shifted, and particularly with this fabulous paper we see here from 2001. Over the past 2 decades, the framing of mining masculinities has shifted, with social implications extending well beyond the scope of coal miners themselves. People increasingly identify with the coal industry and the idea of coal heritage as essential to their understanding of self. So it's in order to better understand the contours of the shift from mining masculinity to post-coal gender frames, I'm going to bring in feminist political economy that I mentioned into conversation with the queer theory of queer time to explain the shifting gender frames. Feminist political economy literature offers an analysis of political economy as always operating through the processes of gender and gendering. And here I'm thinking about J.K. Gibson Graham, as well as many others. Writing in the 1990s, feminist geographer Linda McDowell detailed the decline of the Fordist family wage, the jobs offered nearly exclusively to men that provided ample funds for funding the family. McDowell theorized the new gender order that would come to define neoliberalizations of political economies the world over, as neoliberal political elements dismantled labor regimes that supported family wages and established increasingly precarious low-wage work regimes. So terming this the feminization of labor, McDowell writes that despite their gender, all workers were becoming women workers, whatever their gender. This shift occurred as an overt political backlash to women and LGBTQ movements securing the access to family wages. Melinda Cooper details these politics and the centrality of the heteropatriarchal family and the rise of neoliberal power over the past several decades. Cooper argues that the implicit centrality of the father in the family as neoliberalism's economic actor allowed for an alliance between economic liberals and conservative Christian right that valued men in positions of power. And this coalition formed, Cooper details, at the moment post-1970s when heteropatriarchal families supported through the family wages was imperiled, particularly because of women and LGBTQ rights, social movements gaining ground in a movement when novel queer family structures were being supported by relatively high-wage jobs. So economic liberalizations that followed not only reflected the desire of capital to suppress labor, neoliberalism as we know it, Cooper shows, was a reaction to rearticulate family values in the face of queer and women's social forces. So during that period, Appalachian neoliberalization also involved a process of reordering gender roles. Since the 80s and 90s, employment growth in Appalachia increasingly was limited to service sector, overwhelmingly involved women entering the workforce, with work in general looking more like historically gendered women's work, so-called. Part of the global process of undermining wage jobs as a part of economic liberalization, offshoring labor, and dismantling of labor regulation, in Appalachia, women entered the workforce in droves, but not the mines. By the 80s, discrimination and removal of federal affirmative action and gender equity hiring requirements meant that women did not find work in the mines. Furthermore, coal mining employment continually has fallen, and coal industry working conditions have effectively only worsened as the United Mine Workers of America, the coal miners union, suffered crippling defeats through the 80s and 90s. So today, with schools, healthcare, and retail making up the bulk of employment in the region, people increasingly talk of coal in the past tense. Although importantly, many mining operations are still actually operating and causing vast environmental devastation for residents nearby. But when people talk about coal, they talk about it nostalgically. So queer theory and queer studies of time provide a lens of analysis to theorize nostalgia for this family wage as a fear of the future, a fear of the inability to reproduce the heteropatriarchal family in the decline of heteronormative family work arrangements, that is the feminization of labor. So scholars of queer time detail temporalities that do not follow patterns of reproducing the heteronormative family. As J. Jack Halverson describes, quote, queer subcultures produce alternative temporalities by allowing their participants to believe that their futures can be imagined according to the logics that lie outside conventional forward-moving narratives of birth, marriage, reproduction, and death. Queer theories of time present critiques of these temporalities of the heteronormative family, what Lee Edelman termed reproductive futurism. So queer time operates outside these temporalities, for some as no future, but for others, particularly within queer of color critique, in the radical possibility of another world. So I'm going to get to think about that other world here in this paper. Halberstam discusses queer time as more than about sexuality, but as an outcome of strange temporalities, imaginative life schedules, and eccentric economic practices. Halberstam discusses queer time and other theorists about queering is certainly about sex and sexuality, but it's also defined as the outcomes of temporality itself, of life scheduling, of these non-normative economic activities. Practice is always tied up with the family and gender. And if conceptualized as such, quote from Halberstam, we detach queerness from sexual identity and we come closer to understanding Foucault's comment in Friendship as a Way of Life that, quote, homosexuality threatens people as a way of life rather than a way of having sex. So queer theory here offers an analytic to understand the gendered politics of grievance and nostalgia in Cole's decline. This nostalgic attachment that I document illustrates that heteropatriarchy has enduring purchase, in part because of the sense that in much the same way that Margaret Thatcher famously said of neoliberal austerity, there is no alternative. Queer thought and queer community building from Appalachia present visions for a post-Coal future that may counter a politics of nostalgia and may enable rethinking what an economic transition can mean from the coal fields. And at the end of this talk, I'm going to dive into some perspectives from queer youth in the region on the economic transition. So, and in this paper, I trace the shifting gender frames, shift from pro-coal to post-coal politics in neoliberalized Appalachia. First, I document the rise of pro-coal mobilization and the recent role that mining masculinity played in pro-coal discourses. I then examine the ways that gender is evoked in discourses surrounding the region's economic transition and compare the discourses of economic transition to the policy regimes that support transition. And finally, as I said, I'm going to look at queer youth for an alternative vision of what economic transition can mean. There we go. So pro-coal politics. The West Virginia Coal Association and the coal and other coal industry marketing groups have been central in structuring pro-coal politics, as I've pointed out that Shannon Bell and Richard York argue. However, these media campaigns, festivals, rallies, bumper stickers, and yard signs resonated in a particular way with people in the coal fields as to galvanize this political mobilization. So pro-coal politics revolved around the idea of the masculine coal miner being the breadwinner for the families, but also for the region's economy. Coal industry groups galvanized around the idea that through their actions, they should and could protect this position of the miner, to save the miner. My experiences of pro-coal political mobilization began in May of 2009 when I stood on the other side of the fence than these folks at Marsh Fork Elementary School in the Coal River Valley of West Virginia. There were a lot of miners' wives, women, children, and friends, along with the coal miners in orange stripes. Inside of the fence, we were rallying for a ban on mountaintop removal coal mining and to relocate the elementary school a safe distance from a coal processing facility. On the other side of the fence, they were rallying to stop us from to display their displeasure with that idea. Since then, the amount of Friends of Coal specialty license plates increased exponentially in the coal fields, as did yard signs reading things like "End Obama's War on Coal," "End the War on Coal." However, the history of pro-coal politics actually begins quite earlier, with the West Virginia Coal Association's development of Friends of Coal campaign in 2002. The association sponsored the Coal Bowl, flooded airwaves with a radio TV advertisement that jingled "Coal is West Virginia," and handed out stickers, signs, and a t-shirt that read "Friends of Coal." Here's the jingle.
West Virginia Coal, gonna take you on a ride, gonna take you to the city, to the store and countryside, gonna let you work your magic and your power and your pride. West Virginia Coal, you're on your way. When we go down deep through the dark today, we come up with a light for America, America.
And that was in the early 2000s, on television, radio, everywhere. The Coal Association also sponsored new statues like this one from 2005, and funded museums and festivals to celebrate coal heritage, as well as this massive investment in primary and secondary school educational materials around coal heritage. pro-coal material was popular and traveled well beyond the bounds of West Virginia, with Friends of Coal groups establishing charity license plates in all of the Appalachian states, and similar groups having online Facebook groups around Friends of Coal that were key sites of organizing rallies and counter protests for environmental protest. The Coal Association went to such steps because they saw threats to the industry. Alongside declining employment levels, the coal industry was worried about the multiple fronts of assault from environmentalism. Anti-surface mining movement, assuaged with regulatory legislation in 1977, had begun to win victories against the extensive and destructive mountaintop removal, a key cost-cutting measure for the coal industry. And here's a protest from 2007. A 1999 court ruling had shuttered this Dowtech surface mine over Blair, West Virginia, you see here, and the coal industry was worried about public outcry and further legal battles, as well as, obviously, the concern over climate change, including the threat that the Kyoto Protocol had posed to them in the late 90s, which obviously was averted. The coal industry pushed back against these threats and crafted marketing campaigns to provide more people in the coal fields with the narrative that tree huggers were coming to take their jobs. More importantly, even if you're not directly employed by coal, the industry worked hard to make people feel as though the coal industry was a central part of identity, and to tap into that identity with these concepts of coal's heritage and tap into latent resentments. Why did these efforts work so well to galvanize support and spread a sense that a way of life in the coal fields was under attack? The idea of coal heritage and the coal miner as a shibboleth for coal identity was already present, and coal held a central place in the way that gender identities were being framed in the region. Pro-coal politics played into those gendered subjectivities of coal, relying on the masculinized image of the coal miner as a breadwinner and the idea of coal as holding up traditional hetero family values, despite and in fact because of it was a moment when coal no longer supported the vast majority of coal families in the coal fields. And that's kind of the central piece here. People were not only interpolated as and saw themselves as friends of coal. Pro-coal rhetoric tapped into the anger and grievance at losing those family wage coal jobs. But and the gendered connections were overt, and please forgive the crude imagery here, but alongside the flood of pro-coal Friends of Coal stickers, there was this wave of decals and stickers that touted the rugged masculine toughness of the miner, as well as the sacrifice that the men made for the nation. And many times these decals were emblazoned on large truck windows like we see here, and bumpers with the image of miners pissing on tree huggers or miners crawling, in messages such as father like son. Some of these were overtly sexualized, with messages reading "miners do it in the dark," or crude images about going deep. Other messages exalted the miners as heroes. Coal keeps the lights on, powering America, and miners, thanking miners for what they do and that you don't. Sociologist Rebecca Scott notes that coal mining masculinities not only were defined through the sacrifice of the coal miner in the mining communities to the nation, many people considered, as I've said, these to be real men's work. Whereas service sector work was pitted against service sector work. Environmentalism was also explicitly decried as a heterosexual deviancy. Which really stands out from this 2013 post on a Friends of Coal from West Virginia Facebook page, where two men in green dresses and fairy costumes are hugging a tree. However, despite the shift in political discourse, the coal industry has continued to severely decline since the 2010s. Most of the industry's decline was predicated on and due to market pressures that were easily marketable coal reserves were depleted. Western states produced more and better quality coal, like Wyoming and the Powder River Basin, and American coal demand decreased as the price of natural gas plummeted. And many of those changes in the energy sector were predicted by the federal regulatory system agency well in advance, for decades in advance that this was happening. Pro-coal politics continued to animate politics in the region in the 2016 election, with the outpouring of support for Donald Trump as he promised to bring back coal. But even Trump's presidency and pro-fossil fuel politics were fundamentally unable to, as we saw in that chart earlier, really do even create a bump to stimulate the coal industry. So by 2019, sentiments of grievance, resentment, and nostalgia filled the digital communities that pro-coal politics had created. These included the many Friends of Coal Facebook pages where pro-coal politics and actions had been organized quite effectively years earlier, as well as some of the groups not directly sponsored by the West Virginia Coal Association, like Faces of Coal and Citizens for Coal. In these online forums, people express deep resignation and resentment for a future that seems much darker than an imagined past. This resentment and nostalgia is at times explicitly gendered, with posts recalling when a man could provide for his family, even without overt reference. Posts always imply the erosion of the family and heterosexual household roles. In one example, one former miner posted on the National Friends of Coal page, reacting to a headline about pipeline workers needing to find new jobs after the cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline. How's that working for those still left in southeastern Kentucky? Didn't work out for me. I couldn't even find a job. Under Trump, I was able to rebuild and even start a business for myself for 4 short years. And now I'm sure to lose it. Throughout multiple Appalachian states, Friends of Coal pages in like Citizens for Coal, Count on Coal, and these account for several 100,000 people following each of these pages. And there's frequent posts that just air grievances about the decline of coal, loss of jobs. And many of the people posting, it's important to say, are masculine white people. But there's also a fair number of people who present as feminine who post as well and talk about being coal miners' daughters and wives of coal miners. In response to letters to the editor from a local newspaper or news stories about fossil fuel, we also see individuals posting hundreds of comments taking aim at Democrats, liberals, people who believe in climate change, and anybody that thinks that climate change is more of a concern than fossil fuel jobs. One post from National Friends of Coal responding to something about John Kerry and getting people to work on solar panels retorted, and out of work politicians can learn to code, Riley referencing the rhetoric of coding classes for miners. So between comments that President Biden is a job killer or working for China, a coal miner reacting to a headline heralding Keystone XL's pipeline closure said he was going to, quote, he was going to provide good jobs in place of those lost. They should have had that set up before they did anything, putting the cart before the horse. So like this 2019 protest by laid off coal miners for their back pay, there's a tone of resentment throughout these posts and throughout the current discourse around coal. Additionally, people are nostalgic. They compare the current situation to the security of former jobs. And unlike the frequent posts I documented several years ago in some work that I put out in 2013, few express a genuine hope of a return for coal jobs. However, there's a sense of righteous anger, and there's a fear for a future with increasingly limited politics, or increasingly limited options. In an interview I conducted in September of 2021, an older woman who had grown up in one of these coal communities in Tennessee recalled the moments when the last mines shut in 2020. And she said, and that was sad. The day that they pulled the coal trucks out, that they was all on a line and they blowed their horns for the last time. It reminded me a lot of when my brother passed away. And the company he was driving for down in Cleveland, Tennessee, they come through with his truck and other trucks, and that was exactly how it was that day. Fully unprompted, in this moment in the interview, she also said, I wasn't against coal because I was here from the beginning of my life, and I saw that people that lived here and raised their families, and that there was some that raised big families. They were all raised by coal companies, working for the coal companies. It was our way of life. in her brother's passing, the last coal truck, and she also discusses the last coal train leaving as these momentous moments. To her account, those mines were actually employing a handful, maybe less than 20 men in recent years. And so mourning the train and the truck, I think is what we should understand is a nostalgia, like she's saying, for a way of life and for a moment and for prosperity, not really for those jobs. Amid the shift from pro-coal politics to post-coal nostalgia, there's an emergent discourse about economic transition. While a decade ago, politicians extolled the reign of coal's future, today it seems like there's a near consensus that the region faces a transition away from fossil fuels. Even coal enthusiasts, Kentucky Senator Mitch McConnell here on the right, and longtime serving Congressman Hal Rogers admitted that, from Kentucky also, admitted that the decline of coal was happening, and they offered plans for transitioning coal workers into new employment. Outside of political rhetoric, the discourse of an economic transition has had material effects in structuring major grant programs across the region, such as this one. Federal and local governments, philanthropy, nonprofit, and grassroots movements have launched initiatives, funds, and projects dedicated to support of an economic transition for Appalachia. Alongside philanthropic funding, the Appalachian Regional Commission's Partnership for Opportunity and Workforce and Economic Revitalization, that is POWER here, what an acronym, has provided over $300 million in federal funding to help areas affected by the decline of coal and to diversify their economies. That is since 2016. These largely focus on training workers for new jobs and money for projects that stimulate entrepreneurship. Many depictions of an economic transition imply that through these programs, classes, or trainings, people could remake themselves and, importantly, still access that family wage. In many of the documents and media portrayals of economic transition programs, the barriers to success are personal, a focus on individual agency, squarely placing people's success or failure in terms of their personal ability, commitment, or strength, and not on systemic factors. One such instance is the representation that was a former worker transition in entrepreneurship program called Green Mining Model Business Program. The project targeted out-of-work coal miners and their families, and they targeted them for trainings on how to run lavender farms on former surface mines in southern West Virginia. The program's advertisement aired on regional television in 2018 and across social media.
Finally happened. I'm back here on site. Some said this day might never come. But here I am. Running crops instead of coal. I never dreamed I'd be farming for a living. And there's real money in it too.
The Green Mining Model Business Program is creating opportunities for Appalachian miners and their families. Learn more by texting or calling 304-362-962.
So, in that video, we see, I think the gender implications there are obvious, but those trainings resulted in basically no one becoming lavender farmers. $1.5 million program that I believe, from my investigation, maybe had one family turn to lavender farming. Another illustrative example is that of Mind Minds, a nonprofit offering free coding classes with the intention of, quote, turning coal miners into computer programmers. This Pennsylvania-based operation that extended into West Virginia became a regional phenomena overnight. Dozens of interviews news outlets, television shows, Joe Manchin, senator from West Virginia, giving them direct funding and sending like congratulations to them. These promotional materials that the nonprofit and media outlets displayed about their operation regularly depicted these masculinized, burly young coal miners as their target subject, covered in coal dust and orange, the classic orange striped overalls. They often would post on Twitter with these taglines, hashtag coal to code, and that united several of these software companies and training programs across the region. It was particularly active in 2017. And the nonprofit clearly touted their program could secure substantial wages for graduates, espousing a bootstrap ethic on Twitter. Quote, they tweeted, tech boot camps are not easy. If you aren't dedicated, passionate, and humble, you'll fail. Nobody is handed a career with a six-figure salary. Kind of precisely this liberal subject of someone who can be a self-made man. However, like many of these funded programs, Mine Mines use the image of coal mining and the idea of the family-waged future to get funds and to get people to take part in these programs, but ultimately they were unable to deliver. Few of the attendees actually finished the coding classes, and they were often taught by recent grads, and few of them were actually miners. Most of the people that were data had since surfaced that most of the people taking these classes were in service sector employment, looking for other employment options. So like the for-profit education and credential programs that Tracy Cottom describes as lower ed, these boot camps promised middle-class jobs for a tech economy that few participants were able to find. And in a more direct enactment of transitioning workers to high-end waged industrial jobs, a number of federal investments have also sought to create job pathways out of coal work for miners, with direct money from the Department of Labor, such as this invested at least 20 million at this point in grants for training dislocated workers in Appalachian coal mining since 2012. Roughly 1/3 of the ARC Power Initiative's $250 million economic transition programs went to workforce training and development outside of the Department of Labor's programs. So while policy there's been all of this money invested, but policy analysts argue that the trainings will not guarantee high-waged employment if those jobs simply do not exist in the region. People, this is the trend that we've seen thus far, will just go somewhere else, such as construction industries elsewhere or heavy machinery operating elsewhere. Much of the rhetoric around economic transition describes job creation through stimulus investments, creating new family wage jobs. However, and relies on this idea. However, as a Keynesian vision for economic growth, such efforts are largely unrealizable under a regime of neoliberal developmentalism. So what I'm trying to argue is that the Power Initiative, for instance, illustrates how neoliberal developmentalism operates in Appalachia. The Power Initiative devolves responsibility from a central government, focuses on worker training and individuals to be better job seekers, and largely provides funds to stimulate business growth, which does not necessarily mean employment growth. So the failure to create these promised family wage jobs also feeds, particularly in light of the discourse that this should be happening, it feeds a politics of grievance, resentment, and nostalgia in response to the idea of economic transition. And here's where I'm gonna wrap this talk up. Queer youth offer visions of Appalachia's economic transition that go beyond Keynesianist neoliberal visions of growth and development after coal. Queer youth offer these visions in part because of a lack of nostalgia for the heteropatriarchal hegemony that coal mining held together through the family wage structure. Queer youth may be able to envision a bright future without coal easier than others that are more emotionally invested in white men's futures. Sheep farmer and producer and podcast producer Ray Geringer articulates a vision for economic transition in Appalachia that draws from the leadership of queer Appalachian youth. And that's a photo of Geringer there. And Geringer writes, we envision an Appalachian future in which working with Appalachians, people aren't asked to choose between having a job at all and doing work that goes against their values. We envision an Appalachian transition in which community-based campaigns around racial justice in the mountains go hand in hand with campaigns to develop new economic possibilities. Geringer was part of the STAY project, Staying Together Appalachian Youth, for many years, and their queer oral history came out, Geringer's queer oral history came out of interviews conducted with other youth in the project. STAY provides this space for youth that might otherwise think that leaving the region is their only option, and a space to connect with other young people in Appalachia. Drawing on the work of Halberstam, Geringer critiques metronormativity that assumes that queer people must go to big cities to be happy. So part of the political imagination of STAY and the vision of the post-coal future that members put forward is lived in their everyday experience of building lives in rural Appalachian communities. Kenny Bilbray, former director of STAY, considers providing space and institutional support for queer and of color youth to stay in rural Appalachia a central piece of the fight to make Appalachia a place they want to live. It's, this is kind of iterative work. In that fight for space, Bilbray and Ada Smith, who's also part of STAY and helped found it, and many others campaigned, for example, against prison construction that had been billed as economic development, a project that had billed as creating more jobs, and they launched the Letcher County Governance Project, for instance. So that anti-prison development work was only a piece among a larger vision for a transition to non-extractive economies as part of queer life in the region. Ivy Brashear, who runs the Just Transition program at the Mountain Association in Kentucky, explains that the broader vision for Appalachian futures. The whole idea of building from what we have, using what we have to move the economy into one that is not extractive. That is of being extractive is building from within, that instead of being extractive, it's building from within and building from who we are as a people. So Brashear, also a queer young voice in the region, has recently pushed for a vision of alternative economic development further. And she states, we are seeking true transformation, not just transition, critiquing the discourse of economic transition and just transition. Brashear critiques the concept of just transition as an endpoint for regional policymakers, proposing that any transition should serve as a means to a more inclusive, more just economy, not just itself the goal. Geringer explains what this might mean. They write, we demand a future in our communities, in our region, in our country, in our world, in which staying in communities that raised us is as good an option as leaving, in which that doesn't mean you won't survive, but you are able to thrive. We fight like hell for a future in which queer youth, queer of color, and all mountain youth grow up not with a sense of doom, but instead with a sense of expansive and liberatory possibility. A vision of is an enactment of queer time, confronting the temporality of heteromasculinity, as this report from the Highlander Center documents. So finally, in conclusion, political theorist Wendy Brown argues that the contradictions of neoliberal political rationality are such that there is, quote, no future for white men. However, as Brown argues, if white men can't see a future for themselves, it seems they would prefer there to be no future for anyone else. If white men, quote, cannot own democracy, there will be no democracy. If white men cannot rule the planet, there will be no planet. The shifting cultural politics of coal and Appalachia resonate with Brown's assessment. From post-coal politics to post-coal politics, a gendered politics of pro-coal advocacy shifted to a politics of grievance, to a fear of a queer future. However, the failure to plan for a future without coal is not a natural sequence of events. The failure to plan for coal's seemingly inevitable demise is the success of neoliberal policies. Neoliberal developmentalism spurned government involvement in issues of poverty or employment, instead focusing on investment in private industry and market supports. Planning for government intervention in the collapse of the region's main industry was outside of that scope of work. Many people believed that the coal industry could provide hetero masculine family wages indefinitely into the future, if not interfered by liberals, Democrats, and tree huggers. And as these jobs declined, they've spurned a crisis of masculinity, one that fed into the deep resentment about environmentalists, about the left, and about coastal wealthy elites, and anyone that can be blamed for coal's demise. And this crisis and resentment is certainly understandable, given the alternative looks bleak. Family wages upheld a high quality of life for some families. Yet those wages never offset the wealth of poverty that plagues many in this region. So like Brown's assessment of white men's future in Appalachian, the internal contradictions of pro-coal politics in a post-coal decline have only deepened economic inequalities and exacerbated resentment towards urban America. White men struggle to see a future for themselves, and many struggle to see a future for the region. But others offer new visions, and queer youth imagine and are creating queer economies for the future of the region. And we should look to those visions for guidance in novel politics and political strategy as neoliberal hegemony in its gendered and sexual articulations reorient and fall into crisis. Thank you all so much. And I really appreciate you bearing with me. So turn it over to you, Peter.
Thank you so much, Gabe. I think, you've got a kind of a massive round of applause here coming up in emojis. That was a fascinating talk, really, really interesting. Thank you so much. And we've got people echoing that in the chat as well. So Louise, you had a question. It came in fairly early in the talk, and I think possibly Gabe kind of answered some aspects of this. Do you feel like you're so you're asking about resistance within the community to the impacts of coal and gender within this? Do you feel like your question was answered, or do you want more explanation?
Yeah, I mean, definitely to some extent. It was really interesting to hear about the end. Yeah, the talk was really great, Gabe. Thank you so much. I guess my question was really around, gendered subjectivities, and you'd been mentioning the impacts of coal on the community. So of course, there's positives to coal historically, but obviously we know of the health impacts and the other impacts of, like for the local environment as well as the wider environment. And I guess I was just interested to hear from your research if there was any forms of, those forms of resistance or contestation within the community, and the role of gender in that, like who maybe was resisting or who was bearing most of the brunt of those health impacts from coal mining. I'd just be interested if you had any insights on that.
Sure, yeah. No, I really appreciate the question, and I think it's a really important one, and one that I kind of run roughshod over in the talk, of kind of too many pieces to keep together. But yeah, historically, there has been massive amounts of resistance, particularly on the environmental level. And a lot of environmental protest, both in the 70s or starting in the 60s. And then again, in the early 2000s, there's waves of environmental protest, both of which led by women in the community. And I don't really talk about that in the talk, but it's distinctly a gendered. And there's a great book on this. Their roots run deep as ironweed. Women in environmental justice struggle in Appalachia. Shannon Bell is the author, and it documents women's role in leading the anti-surface mining movement in the 2000s. And very central. And what I would also add is that I think queer youth have also been central in that movement in recent decades. In the recent decade, is that my research and in the region over years has kind of documented the way that some of, like that Stay project, people not only fighting for visions of economic futures, a lot of those young people were involved early on in what was called the Mountain Justice movement. And it was, in many ways, a space that encouraged queer community and, people living together in these huge group houses. And was a central piece of fighting the coal industry, but that's also what triggered a lot of the pro-coal politics. You know, in the early 2000s, effective anti-strip mining movements won gains, and I think the coal industry saw that as deeply troubling and to their bottom line, and therefore were effective at galvanizing support around a masculinized image. So, and I think I was trying to get at some of that in the talk.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Do we have any other questions? If not, I've got a question, but I'll let others jump in.
Yeah,
Okay.
I have a question actually. And that is that, first of all, that was a fascinating talk and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you very much. One of the I'm not a geographer, I'm a geologist. and I tuned in today because, you know, I'm looking at the Marcellus natural gas, which is sort of in the same area. But the it looks to me in many ways that I appreciate what you're saying about the gender issues, but it seems to me that underlying a lot of that are fundamental economic issues.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of wondering, are there any analogs from similar economic changes, and can they give us any sorts of insights as to how this might evolve? The one that comes to mind is the early 19th century transition from small farming to manufacture, which had some of the same impacts on communities. And I'm wondering if you've looked at that, and is there anything in that that is perhaps useful?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. That's a fascinating, it's a fascinating query. I haven't really thought too much about the analogs to farming transition. I will definitely say, yes, it's, I think you're totally right. This is at core economic reorientation. And I guess I'm trying to understand how people live through that economic transformation in gendered ways. You know, that the economic situation is always is also a gendered arrangement. The work arrangement is at least here, and I think everywhere else, a gendered arrangement. So trying to understand the implications of that shifting, reorienting, in many ways collapsing work arrangement. And yeah, I think it's, I mean, what I'm immediately thinking about with farming transition is, you know, the rise of particular kinds of agrarianisms, as well as, I don't know if you're thinking about this far back, but the crisis of masculinity in the growth in urbanization. And, you know, Theodore Roosevelt and the rise of the Boy Scouts and these kind of gendered institutions as agrarian ways of life declined, and there was a romanticism for the country, the rural, and space, and the geographies that made men men. So I'm thinking about that, but I'm not sure that there's an exact analog here, you know, because I don't know that we're going to see I think, I guess part of my part of what I'm trying to grapple with in this talk is that there's actually very few men still left coal mining, right? Or and even in the last several decades, very few people are still involved in this. So I'm not sure if there's actually going to be a resurgence, or there is a certain nostalgia, but I don't think, you know, we're going to see a kind of nostalgic renaissance of like sending boys off to become real men by breaking rocks or working in fossil fuels. But I think that there are similar, yeah, I guess I'll say I should think more about those resonances. So I appreciate the question.
Can I chip in there, Gabe and Sam? I think it's really interesting that that kind of idea of resonance is there for an area like the one that I live in, which is the northeast in the UK, which historically was always kind of a mining area, which had very similar kind of masculinist discourses around mining and kind of a pride and celebration around that. And really thinking in the present day context, how those kind of senses of identity are still, even kind of 40 years on from, you know, massive decline, like Thatcherism and the massive decline of coal in the UK, those senses of identity are still lingering and still kind of having effects in contemporary politics here now, and in no small effect kind of play into some of the things around Brexit and so on that we're seeing at present. That wasn't where I was going to question though, where my question came from, but I think it is interesting to think about those resonances. I think it's yeah, your talks really got me thinking about the case in the UK. My question was really building on, or kind of getting at something very similar to Sam's point, though, in that I wanted to ask whether you'd given any consideration to the specificity of coal here. And here I'm thinking really drawing on kind of Timothy Mitchell's work. I don't know whether you've come across it or read it, but how he talks about kind of very different kind of social formations developing around, say, coal compared to oil. And I wonder whether there's an extension of that at play here, whether, you know, the same kind of, I mean, you touched on it a little bit in relation to the Keystone Pipeline, but I wondered whether you've got any reflections on whether there are particularities to coal that are leading to certain kind of forms of discourses being mobilized here, or whether actually coal is, you know, this is true of kind of most kind of fossil fuel based industries. But yeah, I'd love to hear more on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, Peter, I really appreciate the question. I think it bears more study to think about whether the particularities of coal and the materialities of coal, as opposed to other fossil fuels, in particular natural gas and the oil extraction and other fossil fuel workers. You know, I definitely think what we're seeing with coal, at least in Appalachia, and maybe I think I'm also fascinated to think about the northeast of England as well. You know, is the lingering politics, community politics of coal's collectivism, or maybe not collectivism, but collectivity, right? You know, coal mining, like Mitchell points out, requires a number of men to be together, or doesn't require a number of men, it requires a number of people to be together. And in its articulation has brought these men together and has in Appalachia a century and a half of labor politics, of regional politics based around the idea that you have a bunch of workers who are working together. So I think that is different, you know, in the sense that it also, in Appalachia at least, created these communities that were coal communities. You know, I think when I think about like oil and natural gas, you don't see the like coal towns. You don't see the remnants of company owned, you know, in Appalachia everywhere the landscape is littered with the literal remnants of housing that was built by coal companies, schools, churches, hospitals built by coal companies and by the unions. So you have this legacy of, and sometimes even nostalgia for the wealth that coal created in community infrastructure and in community connectivity. You know, what I will say though, that I think is a little different today is that, so I think there's those resonances that are culturally very important, that are bearing on people's decisions. You know, what I think is different today is that actually coal mining is increasingly more similar to to other kinds of fossil fuel extraction as it is mechanized, and as it becomes also turns more towards surface mining in Appalachia. So even part of the decline of coal is actually not the strict output of production. There's actually quite a bit of steel grade coal coming out of the region. It's just 5 men and heavy machinery, not the 25 or 50 or 100 that had been in a mine. So I think what we're seeing today is in the reorientation of work and in mechanization, I think those politics are eroding as well. So yeah, I think that bears study, is to think about the relationship between those cultural aspects of what coal had created in community and what it creates today, which is very few and almost no union job. Well, not no union jobs, but vastly fewer union jobs than it once did.
Yeah, I think that kind of, so you've got the kind of collectivity aspect of it, but you've also got the duration of that, and the length of time that over which extraction takes place, which is really interesting. Yeah, absolutely fascinating reflections there, Gabe. Thanks. Does anybody else have any questions rather than me just gabbling on? I have got one other, if in the meantime, while other people are thinking here, Gabe. Just around kind of, I was really struck by your comments on how environmentalism has become associated, or has become the focus of a kind of a gendered language of kind of or a gendered discourse of kind of heterosexual deviancy, I think was the word that you put, the way that you framed it. I was wondering about the kind of the history of that, and kind of in what other environments we may have seen kind of that mobilized. It doesn't strike me as a discourse that is entirely novel to this this particular case. And I also kind of, I think we've seen examples of kind of environmentalism become, if not feminized, then definitely kind of the focus of this kind of lefty liberal kind of or kind of snowflake agenda, which is that contrasts against a kind of the kind of strong masculine kind of incredibly kind of traditional gender representations. I wonder kind of how much you've kind of gone into that and kind of unpicked the histories of those discourses, or whether anybody in this call has.
Yeah, I would be. I have not really. It's something that comes up obviously in my research, but I would be fascinated to hear if somebody else here on this webinar has gone through those or has thoughts on that, because it is certainly a central. Obviously, those articulations are present, but yeah, I think it bears more research. It really does, and bears more study.
Sorry, we just got pulled back. Okay, Abby's got a question. Do you want to read it out, Abby, or shall I?
I can read it out.
Beautiful.
Yeah, so thanks for this wonderful talk. Totally fascinating, and I'm already sharing it with some of my colleagues. So I think we'll find your work really great and helpful for thinking through some things we're working on in other places. I found it really interesting that the promotion of lavender farming failed, despite its, playing on these dominant cultural discourses. And I've been thinking about it and just trying to puzzle through what we can learn from that. I mean, was it basically that this was just not a very well designed or well thought through program that wasn't economically viable, or was it not culturally resonant? So what can we take away from the failure of using that strong heteropatriarchal worldview, but then it doesn't resonate, it doesn't connect with people? What do you make of that, Gabe?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting idea, and I really appreciate the question. I think for one side, it just wasn't economically viable, or at least what they were promoting wasn't economically viable for that particular case. Actually may have more to do with the structures of grant funding, which maybe is like not really getting at your question, but they got enough money to make the advertisement and give some people a class, and then they were like, all right, see if you can fly, and perhaps obviously people couldn't just go and start farming, because small scale farming is actually, at least in the United States, extremely difficult to make it if you don't have large amounts of capital. So I think in that way it was economically viable, and just like many of these projects, a poorly planned piece of economic development infrastructure. But I think on the other side, yeah, I don't know if I don't know about the cultural, the cultural question. Like, was it just that people don't, because there is a they're actually outside of that particular case of like that particular training program, people could be doing more lavender farming. It's very actually lucrative. It has the potential to be lucrative, can be done on former strip mine sites. So the question of why is that not something that people have turned to in greater numbers is an interesting cultural question. I will say there's actually one operation that has started recently producing commercial amounts of lavender in 2020, actually. So maybe it's beginning, but the person who started is also like a PhD from Pennsylvania who's not from the region. So it's, yeah, there's perhaps a bit of both going on there. There's a bit of both, but and then the last thing I'll say is that, I think lavender farming, like many of these other projects, it's not necessarily that they couldn't work, but the stimulus given to them is just too little. The economic development regime just has not invested in these things, right? Like they invest enough to spark entrepreneurship in a kind of a classic neoliberal sense, but not enough to say, flood the market to like ensure employment. So that's also part of it. But yeah, thank you for that question.
Thank you so much for your talk. That was a great explanation. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have any other questions before we wrap up? Okay. Well, thanks again, Gabe. I really, really appreciate you coming along and speaking to us today. It's been absolutely fantastic, really, really interesting. And I look forward to kind of reading more of your work in the months ahead. Reminder, do check out Gabe's paper as well. It's available online. And I just really need to now just kind of remind you guys that our webinar series continues in January on the 21st of January. So again, it's the normal Friday, 1 to 2:30 p.m. GMT. And for that session, we're joined by Helena Aalborg and Oluf Falahan Osun Moyiwa. Gosh, I'm sorry, I've absolutely butchered that. Both from Chalmers University, and they're going to be talking about reframing power and gender struggles in energy projects as territoriality and placemaking. So that should be another really great talk. We're really looking forward to seeing them on the 21st of January. But otherwise, have a lovely Christmas. It's great seeing you all here again. And Gabe, thanks again. That was fabulous. Take care, guys. Have a great Christmases.
Thank you so much, Peter.
No worries, Gabe. Thank you.